So I'm going to preach on Paul because I feel like I've preached on that gospel like twice in a row. And it was somewhat thematic. If you go on our website, you'll see one sermon with a picture of bread and the next sermon with a picture of wine. It's very lovely. We have a new website, by the way, and it's quite enjoyable. But we're going to be going, I want to talk about Paul. And in particular, I was drawn to this passage at the very end of Paul. He says, pray for me also, so that when I speak, a message may be given to me to make known with boldness the mystery of the gospel, for which I am an ambassador in chains. An ambassador in chains. And this speaks in some way to one of the great paradoxes that's at the heart of the gospel and the heart of being a Christian, and really even being someone who loves. That Paul in chains was more free than his captors. That Jesus on the cross was more free than those who crucified him. That when we follow God and try to keep the commandments and follow Jesus, we are more free than if we went about kind of doing whatever we wanted. I remember first hearing this in seminary, and I found it immediately confusing and even slightly annoying. That those who choose to follow God are more free than those who follow their instincts and their impulses. I found it frustrating because I didn't quite understand what they were talking about. But I learned that there were different kinds of freedom. And I think I learned it in some ways when I first went off to seminary living on my own in a little cabin in the Tennessee wilderness. As a point of illustration, as a child, I had to be home at 6 p.m. on the nose. Every evening of my life as a child. And this was before the age of cell phones, so there was no texting. When I got on my bike and wheeled off with my friends, my parents had no idea where we went. We went to all sorts of places. We went down by the stream near our place. We went by another stream that was very, very far away from our place. And no matter where we went, we were instructed to be home precisely for 6. And at the time, I yearned for the freedom to stay out as long as I wanted. And I did have friends whose parents didn't seem to really care when they got home. And they were able to stay out as long as they wanted. And I thought, wouldn't that be fantastic? To have the kind of parents who didn't care whenever you got home. I thought Geoff, the 13-year-old. And this continued on, and I obviously was afforded more freedom when I was in university, although I still lived at home, but there was still this deep call in the form of a deep guilt to make sure that I was still home for dinner at 6 o'clock. And this continued throughout my undergrad. Sometimes I was away, but it was kind of the default for our family. And that whole time, I think, sometimes in the front of my mind, sometimes in the back, I would think, wouldn't it be lovely to eat dinner whenever I wanted and stay out as long as I wanted? And then I got my wish. And I was living in this cabin in the Tennessee wilderness, and I could eat whatever I wanted. I didn't have to eat my salad. I didn't even have to make a salad. I remember one of my early meals was steak, Kraft dinner, and a Coke. And I undercooked the Kraft dinner. I overcooked the steak until it was a brick, and the Coke was warm. And I sat in my only chair that I own in front of this little tiny television with my movie I rented from the library. And I started to understand the freedom of being loved. Right? I could do whatever I wanted, but there were all of these things that I couldn't do. I didn't have anybody that I could have dinner with, especially in those first weeks and first months. I didn't have anybody I could have dinner with where I could speak my mind. I couldn't meet with people who knew me. I didn't have a place at any table. And I went from those first few weeks of feeling enormously free to suddenly feeling captive in that little cabin. I had my own car. I was like the only person I knew in the entire state of Tennessee. I could have, lit off fireworks. Who knows what I could have done. And I didn't feel free at all. And I yearned to be around people who loved me and who knew me so that I could be free to be myself. This is the paradox of being loved. And it's a wonderful kind of captivity, right? There's the love of family that we can experience. There's the love of God. Paul himself is captive, and yet we know that he had such deep love for God that liberated him. He loved those churches so much that he kept writing them letters. We only have a few left, but we can imagine Paul constantly writing letters, right? And there would be scribes that would come to visit him in prison, and they'd sit across the bars from him, and he would dictate these letters, and then they would go off. He probably wrote hundreds and hundreds of letters as he continued to love those churches even from prison, and we know that he would have loved his captors. And of course, out of love, there's a different kind of captivity that can sometimes challenge us. I can tell you that, and Sarah will hate me mentioning anything about the wedding, but I have to mention the wedding, and we have a different kind of captivity because we feel this profound obligation to get it right for the people that we love. We want to be generous in the right way. We want to make sure that everybody knows that they're loved. And it can be an enormous amount of pressure sometimes. When you love people, we're bringing all our families are coming from hither and thither. And you want to get it right. And of course, to the outside world, those who love in any way can seem completely crazy. Because it doesn't look like freedom. Right? I think perhaps in the minds of, if you think about the mind of the world, whatever that is, it's someone with perfect freedom, right? The perfect to do whatever they want. You think of a billionaire, right? They can buy whatever they want, they can fly wherever they want, they can go wherever they want. But that's not the freedom of the gospel at all. As soon as you fall in love with anyone or anything, you start to look kind of crazy because you're giving up your freedom left and right to be with people that you love. You might even think of art. I remember doing my music degree, and I'd see these pianists. I could only play for a certain amount of hours as a brass player, but those poor piano players would be in this little tiny glass chamber alone with a grand piano for 4 hours, 6 hours, 8 hours. Like Chun-Sen, I don't even know. If you think about poor Chun-Sen in university, I don't even know how many hours this poor woman spent in front of a piano, right? And she's not just, regaling herself with Chopin. Sometimes it's just raw scales, back and forth until everything is perfect. And to the outside world, that would seem crazy. But then we see her love for music and the love for music that she inspires in all of us. And suddenly it makes sense. All of that time captive in that practice room, being liberated by the love of music. It's a wonderful thing. And the only caution, I guess I would say, if there is any caution, because I think if we go through this letter from Paul again, most of it, there's some passages in this letter from Paul that are kind of spooky. We have the cosmic powers of this present darkness against the spiritual forces of evil in heavenly places. It's one ominous. I would only suggest that I think, if we think about forces of evil in heavenly places, I would only suggest that sometimes we are called by love to act kind of crazy and be captive for things that we love, art that we love, people that we love, our families, our loved ones, and our friends. And other times there are things that look just like love that aren't. I'm thinking about any of those classic addictions that we can think of. And how often when we think about addiction, do we think about loving that addiction? It looks a lot like love. And people will do really crazy things to be close to that thing which they love. But it leads down a road of self-destruction, of self-annihilation. And sometimes it behooves those people who love us to remind us that even though you love whatever that thing is, we love you, and that's not a good thing. It looks a lot like love, it feels a lot like love, but it isn't. That's the closest I can think of when I think of spiritual forces of evil in heavenly places. The key for pretty much unlocking the entire Old and New Testaments is love. The love of God. Finding ways to love ourselves, our neighbors, our friends, our enemies. Love is always the test. And we're called to become captives of it. To shape our lives around it. To seek out those people who love us and who we love. Those things which we love. To be closer to God. Amen.